Hello and welcome to Lecture 5 of the Romantic Era. Today we're going to be talking about Robert Schumann and his wife Clara, who was born Clara Wieck, and later when she married Robert became Clara Schumann. Let's start with Robert, who was born in 1810, and we're going to be covering some composers who are all born right around the same time. So our last composer, Mendelssohn, was born 1809. Schumann and Chopin, who we're going to talk about next lecture, both born 1810. And then the final composer of this unit, and remember, we are not going all the way through the entire Romantic era. We just don't have enough time. So we're going to stop with our last composer being Franz Liszt, who was born 1811. So all these guys born right around the same time. And all of them, in fact, all of the composers that we will look at in this unit, with the exception of Clara Schumann, all of them were born into families where music was not the family business. Remember I said this is one of these sort of patterns that we see in the Romantic era. Whereas in previous eras, if you became a composer or a musician, it's likely that that's what your family did. So, for example, Mozart's father, Beethoven's father, Bach's entire family, they were all musical families. But going back to our first Romantic composer, remember Schubert, his father was a schoolmaster. Berlioz, his father was a medical doctor and wanted his son to be a medical doctor. Schumann's father was a bookseller and publisher and was quite successful. Actually, they did pretty well. And this had an influence on young Robert, who was the youngest of 5 children, because Robert Schumann grew up around books. And the other love of his life, in addition to music, was reading and literature. And there's a lot of literary inspiration, references to literary works, to certain favorite authors, to certain scenes that are described in certain books. That we find kind of woven into or referenced in Schumann's music. Schumann also, by the way, became something of a writer himself. He was one of the leading music critics of his day, and he co-founded what was one of the most influential music magazines, the New Journal for Music. So he wrote articles, edited, presented this magazine for a number of years, until it was I believe it changed hands, but he continued to contribute articles to this journal for something like 20 years. He was really one of the most influential music critics of the time. And unlike Hector Berlioz, remember Hector Berlioz also wrote music criticism, but apparently he didn't really enjoy it very much. It was something that he had to do in order to make money. But Schumann actually enjoyed writing music criticism, and I think he enjoyed finding new talent. And this is kind of like one of his gifts, I think, at recognizing and promoting the talent of other composers through his magazine. So, for example, remember Franz Schubert. Now, I always have to be careful just to mention Schubert and Schumann, 2 different guys. Franz Schubert we consider him to be like the earliest Romantic and the greatest composer of songs, for example. Well, remember, Schubert was very obscure in his own lifetime. His works were hardly ever performed outside of these sort of small private concerts that Schubert and his friends would put on. So some of Schubert's greatest work was not even performed during his own lifetime, and it was later Robert Schumann who kind of discovered this music, wrote about it in his journal, had it performed. So, for example, I mentioned Mendelssohn gave the premiere of Schubert's C major symphony. This was because Schumann had went and visited Schubert's brother, got the music from Schubert's brother. Schubert had died by this time, and sent it to Mendelssohn, who put on the first professional performance of that symphony. Frédéric Chopin was recognized early on by Schumann. Before Chopin was really well known outside of Poland, Schumann heard him play and wrote a rave review calling Chopin a genius. And then later, Johannes Brahms famously was essentially kind of discovered by Robert Schumann, who again wrote a glowing article about this unknown 20-year-old pianist composer who just kind of showed up at their house one day. I'll talk a little bit about that story when I get to talking about Clara. But getting back to Robert Schumann, did have some musical training as a child, but it wasn't like super intense. Let's say it wasn't the case that Robert Schumann was a child prodigy, like his own wife Clara was, or like Mendelssohn was. So it was not at all clear that he was going to be, let's say, a professional musician of some kind. However, his father did encourage his music study. Unfortunately, though, his father died when he was 16 years old, and his mother was not as enthusiastic about music being a career for her son. So what she wanted him to be was a lawyer. So he went to college for law, and apparently didn't go to class very much. He mostly just went to concerts and wrote music and read books, was not really interested in the law. And we have actually Schumann's letters between him and his mother, where he's trying to persuade her to let him pursue music as a career instead of law. And you can imagine, I mean, there are probably similar conversations going on. They wouldn't be letters, they would be texts or emails between parents and their children today. I want to drop out of college, I want to be a musician. Not necessarily what every mother wants to hear. But they came to a sort of a deal. Robert said, look, why don't we do this? There's this piano teacher you might have heard of, Friedrich Wieck. His daughter is the child prodigy, Clara Wieck. And this is when Clara was probably about 10 years old, because she was born 9 years after Robert. Robert was born 1810, Clara was born 1819. So while Clara was still a little kid, Robert, as a college student, said, look, why don't we go to Mr. Wieck, and I will play something for him, and he can work with me a little bit, and he can evaluate me and determine whether I have any future as a pianist. And if he says I should give it up, or I should do something else, I should study law, then that's what I'll do. So this was agreeable to Schumann's mother, and Robert Schumann went to Friedrich Wieck, I guess had some lessons with him, and Friedrich Wieck wrote to Schumann's mother, your son is very talented. If you let him study with me for 3 years, I can assure you he will be one of the greatest pianists of our time. So that sounds pretty encouraging. Schumann is like 19 or 20 years old. This is kind of a late age to be deciding on your career, especially if that career is going to be concert pianist. And that's really what Schumann wanted to be initially, was more of a pianist necessarily than a composer. Although in those days, most performers did some composing and most composers did some performing. So there wasn't sort of like a bright line between one or the other. Any case, Schumann threw himself into practicing many, many hours a day. But maybe a year or so into this intense period of study with Friedrich Wieck, he developed some kind of a condition with his right hand, maybe something involving the nerve, loss of control of his fingers, sought some medical treatment, and actually even made a sort of a contraption of some kind, which he refers to in his letters as the cigar box device. So some kind of a machine, maybe based on the lid of a cigar box with weights and strings and pulleys or something like this. He basically made like a little exercise machine for his finger, whichever finger was afflicted. I think it was his fourth finger. But this did not help, probably made it worse, and it became clear that Schumann was not going to be a concert pianist. However, he was not discouraged. He decided instead to throw himself into composition instead. And it all kind of worked out because eventually, now remember, the time period I'm talking about when he starts this period of study with Friedrich Wieck was when he was 20 years old, and Clara was about 11 years old. But by the time Clara was, let's say, about 16, and Robert would have been 25, they were in love, and Schumann figured, well, I don't need to play the piano, I can just compose. And Clara, who's one of the world's greatest pianists, can play my pieces for me. And so this was kind of the arrangement that they had. But the fly in the ointment was that Friedrich Wieck did not much like the idea of his daughter marrying Robert Schumann. Thought that Schumann was kind of a little bit eccentric, which he was. Unfortunately, his eccentricity was probably the budding mental illness, which would manifest itself a little bit later in his 20s and 30s. But also just didn't know if this guy was going to be successful or not. He was definitely not going to be successful as a pianist because he had this condition with his hand. He had given up on his law career to study piano, and now instead he thinks he's going to be a composer. Well, we'll see about that. So Friedrich Wieck forbade his daughter to marry Robert Schumann, and there were court battles, and it was kind of messy. Eventually, Clara just had to wait until she was of legal age to be married without her father's consent. So on the day before her 19th birthday, she was married to Robert. And considering some of the struggles that they went through, especially with Robert's deteriorating mental health, they had a pretty happy marriage. And they had 7 children. And one of Friedrich Wieck's fears about his daughter marrying Robert Schumann did not come to pass. That is, he was afraid that all of this training that he had given his daughter, sort of like the way Mozart's father had invested so much in his son and wanted his son to be successful. Friedrich Wieck was worried that his daughter was just going to wind up, sort of the wife of a middling composer and music critic, and that all this training and all of her talent would be wasted because, of course, she would probably give up her performing career to settle down and be a wife and have children. That's not the way it turned out, actually. Clara continued to have a very busy career, touring the world. Sometimes Robert would come along on these tours. Well, I should say touring Europe and Russia, and performing. And considering, again, that they had 7 children, during a lot of these concerts, she was either pregnant or just had recently had a child. And this is a time when childbirth was a bit more dangerous, and they didn't have anesthesia. So it was more arduous, let's say. So she did maintain her performing career and was recognized throughout her life as one of the greatest pianists of the 19th century. And this partnership really did work out for them. Although, as the book mentions, Clara did do some composing and compose some beautiful music. We have some examples of it in your book. She mostly put that aside after she married because now she saw her mission as promoting her husband's compositional career. And she also performed the works of other composers. She performed some of her own works, performed her husband's works, and performed the works of classical masters like Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, etc. And this was at a time when very often pianists, let's say if you're a performing pianist, you would not necessarily play the work of older composers. You wouldn't play old music. You would play new music. You would play very often your own music, right? And very often the most successful performers, that is the most financially successful, composed what would be considered maybe sort of like trashy, frivolous, entertaining music, maybe with very flashy with a lot of notes, but that was not very meaningful or deep or whatever. So Clara was kind of like an exception in her time, but actually more like what a modern classical pianist does. They play mostly the works of older, masters, recognized masters, play old music for the most part. And this, I think, also this kind of ties into what I've been talking about with, for example, Mendelssohn and Berlioz, about this sort of spectrum of some composers being more radical, more interested in the music of the future, being more experimental, maybe even sometimes kind of shocking the audience, and then those composers who are more conservative, who are looking to the music of the past and trying to sort of preserve this heritage. And I would say the Schumanns are more on the conservative side. They are more allied with like Mendelssohn, who they were very close friends with Mendelssohn. Actually named one of their children Felix after Felix Mendelssohn. And they're sort of more, they're sort of like two different camps, the conservative composers and the radical forward-looking composers. And the Schumanns and later Brahms are definitely associated with the more conservative camp. So Schumann is important certainly as a composer, and we'll talk about his music in a moment. Also important as a music critic, one of the most influential music critics of the time. But he never really managed to hold on to any kind of like a regular job or position for very long. Partly just because of his personality, and then his odd behavior, which was again a manifestation probably of budding mental illness. He was hired for a brief time to be the conductor of the student orchestra at the Leipzig Conservatory. So remember, Mendelssohn was the founder who established the Leipzig Conservatory, this music school in Leipzig, Germany. And the school needed a conductor for the student orchestra, and Mendelssohn offered the job to Schumann, but it became apparent that Schumann was just not cut out for that kind of a job. He didn't do well in front of people. He was a very shy person, and was just not the kind of person who should be leading an orchestra. So that didn't really work out. And as I said, it was really Clara who was the breadwinner for their family. Schumann made some money from publication of his music, and also the publication of his music magazine, the New Journal for Music. But I'm sure Clara earned much more than he did. Probably beginning, I think, in his mid to late 20s, this is when Schumann began to manifest signs of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, by the way, is not multiple personality disorder, although I will talk about there are definitely multiple personalities in Schumann's music, which he himself kind of acknowledged and sort of tapped into the different sides of his personality. Nonetheless, Schumann did not suffer from multiple personality disorder. He suffered from schizophrenia, which is when people hear voices, or they feel like other thoughts are being broadcast into their head, or that their thoughts are being broadcast to other people, like other people can read their minds. There are many different symptoms, but schizophrenia is something usually that manifests itself maybe in the late teens or 20s. And although he had a couple of breakdowns before it, I think it was his later 20s when it started becoming apparent. And one of the ways that it would manifest itself in Schumann's case is he would hear music that he thought was being sort of sung to him or played for him by angels. He is sort of, in his letters and whatever, he refers to the angels and their music that he sort of like against his will is appearing in his mind. And there were times that he actually even tried to write down what this music was. But then the angels might turn into devils, and what had been beautiful music would turn into this harsh, discordant, disturbing music. Unfortunately, in 1854, Schumann had attempted suicide. They were living in a house that was right next to the Rhine River, and I believe this is when Clara was off on tour, and Robert was left alone. I don't know if the other children were in the house or not, but apparently he got up on a winter's day, and it just in his like dressing gown or his pajamas or whatever, walked outside and over to the bridge over the Rhine River. This was a toll bridge, and there's a guy at the toll gate kind of looking at him, and Schumann realizes, even in his disturbed state, that he's supposed to pay a toll. So he reaches in his pocket and grabs a handkerchief, hands it to the toll guy, walks out onto the bridge, and jumped in the river. Fortunately, he was pulled out of the river by some fishermen, but at that point he was committed to an asylum where he basically spent the remaining 2 years of his life. And during that time, I believe Clara only was allowed to visit him once. They had very different ideas, again, about the treatment of illness or whatever, whether it was good for a man's wife to come and visit him while he's in the hospital. Of course, today we would say, well, of course, you should visit as much as possible. But back then, no, they actually forbade Clara to visit, although he was allowed to have other guests, like the composer Johannes Brahms visited him on a couple of occasions. Others were allowed to visit him, but Clara was not, for whatever reason. About Schumann's music. Well, first of all, Schumann had this kind of interesting aspect to the way that he composed, in that he would tend to focus on a certain type of composition and just do that for a few years, and then switch to a different type of composition, a different medium, a different genre, and do that, and then switch to something else. So they mention in the book, during the first 10 years of his creative life, let's say from his late teens to his late 20s, Schumann published only piano pieces, and his musical style seemed to grow out of piano improvisations. These piano pieces are, for the most part, what I have been calling character pieces. So remember, a character piece, this is a relatively new genre, right? That is, during the classical era, remember, the typical piano piece or other instrumental piece was like a sonata, big multi-movement work with that generic title, sonata. Character piece is shorter, it's a single movement work, and it always has a descriptive title that gives the listener something to imagine that the piece is about, in a way that the title sonata or concerto or whatever doesn't really tell you anything about what the content is, what you're supposed to feel or what you're supposed to imagine as you listen to the music. Schumann did write 3 sonatas, the typical classical type piece, multi-movement work, but most of his piano music are character pieces. But what he did that's a little different is very often he would take these short character pieces and he would put them together into like a set, which is kind of like, is analogous to a song cycle. So remember when I talked about art songs, I said that most of for example, the songs of Schubert are just individual songs. But sometimes a composer will take a bunch of songs, like maybe 10 or 20, that have some kind of an overall story that ties them together, and the composer will publish them as a set. They're intended to be performed one after another, and there's a title which tells you what the story's about, and each of the songs are like one chapter in that overall story. Schumann does something similar to this with his character pieces. They are kind of grouped together sometimes into what you might call a suite, or what the book calls a cycle. So The example that's in your book, actually, so we have two pieces that are excerpts that are individual pieces, but they are from a cycle, a larger work called Fantasy Pieces. And we'll talk about them a little bit, but just be aware most of Schumann's music are these kind of character pieces, which are very often put into these larger cycles or suites. And they list some of them here. Carnival. Carnival is kind of interesting because, again, it's based on an idea, or let's say a scene in a novel that Schumann was reading at the time that described a carnival. Now, a carnival in this sense is not like where you go today and there's a carnival and there's rides and there's cotton candy and carnival refers to sort of more the Venice or Mardi Gras type of carnival, which comes just before Lent. So that's actually what Mardi Gras means. It means Fat Tuesday. Fat Tuesday is the day before Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday is the beginning of Lent, when you are supposed to give up pleasures like whatever, alcohol or chocolate or whatever. You're not supposed to eat meat. And because that's the preparation, of course, for Easter. So Mardi Gras, or carnival season in Catholic Europe, like in Venice, for example, is when you want to maximize your fun because you're about to undergo 6 weeks of enforced no fun. So the tradition very often in Europe is during carnival season, you go to masked balls. You go to parties where people dress up in costumes. And there was a scene, apparently, that Schumann had read in a book that described a carnival. And so he decided to create a piano piece that is sort of like creating this same kind of scene. And so each of the different movements of carnival are like musical portraits. This is something that Schumann was interested in, trying to depict people musically. Same way that you might draw a portrait of someone in a painting, Schumann's trying to do this musically. But in carnival, there's kind of like two people in each character, because there's the person and then there's the costume that they are wearing, right? So in carnival, so we have a bunch of different characters that are depicted. One of them is young Clara, the young child prodigy. This is before Schumann was romantically interested in Clara. She was only 11 years old at the time. This is one of Schumann's earliest works, written when he was about 21 or 22, I think. And who else is in there? The violinist Paganini, who we will talk about in relation to Franz Liszt in the next lecture. The most famous violinist of his day, Niccolò Paganini, is depicted in one of the movements of Carnival, and it sounds like a super difficult violin piece, but it's played on the piano because it's a work for piano. The composer Chopin, who Schumann had recently met, is also included, and his portrait of Chopin is basically a short piece in the style of Frédéric Chopin, our next composer. And it's a wonderful piece. It actually sounds kind of like more like Chopin than Chopin himself. It's sort of like an homage to this style, which apparently Chopin didn't really appreciate. Maybe he felt he was being caricatured or made fun of. But I think it was a sincere tribute and sort of a gesture of respect in Schumann's sort of imitating the style of Chopin in creating like a miniature portrait of Chopin. Also in this work and in other works by Schumann, there are aspects of Schumann's own personality which he kind of turned into characters. He did this not only in his music, but also in his music criticism. So in his reviews, it wouldn't just be sort of like a review that you might read today in a newspaper. Like, I went to this concert and they played these these particular songs from the new album, or they played their old hit, and this is what was good about it, this was what was bad about it. Schumann's reviews were very often in the form of sort of a discussion, a dialogue among these different characters. And these different characters were different manifestations of Schumann's own personality. The two most important being the character of Florestan, who represented this sort of wild, impulsive, emotional, romantic aspect of Romanticism, and Eusebius. And Eusebius is more like the quiet, introspective, melancholy side of Romanticism. And these were made-up characters, but in the reviews that Schumann wrote, they might sort of like have little debates about the concert that they had just been to. And we find elements of them in Schumann's music as well. And sometimes he would even write the letter F or the letter E to indicate whether a piece is more in the Florestan character or more the gentler Eusebius character. So kind of strange, but this was, again, Schumann is kind of a strange, eccentric composer, but also very much into characters and trying to paint portraits of these characters. Anyway, so they mentioned the year that he is married, Schumann switches from composing piano music to composing songs, and Schumann is recognized as probably the second greatest composer of art songs after Schubert. Schubert is number one in the area of art songs, but Schumann, I think, is recognized as number two. So definitely a very significant composer of piano music, of songs, also of chamber music. So there are a number of string quartets. There's a very popular piano quintet. There's a piano trio, piano quartets by Schumann. That's probably his other, definitely a significant composer of chamber music in the 19th century. Also composed symphonies. His symphonies are not played quite as often as his piano music or his songs or his chamber music, but you do still see them performed by symphony orchestras today. There are 4 symphonies by Schumann. He composed one opera, wasn't very successful. It was performed a couple of times in his lifetime, but I've never seen it, or I've never seen advertised a performance of Schumann's one opera. Did compose some other vocal works. There's oratorios, for example, which were more successful than his opera was. So really, Schumann composed all the different genres of music at the time, but definitely best known for his piano music, his art songs, and his chamber music. So as an example of his music, we have in your listening 2 individual works which are part of one of these larger cycles, or I call them suites. That is just sort of like a collection, a multi-movement, large work that contains many short little character pieces as individual movements. So the title of this piece is Fantasy Pieces, Fantasiestücke in German, and it's 8 short character pieces. Notice the idea for this title, Fantasy Pieces, was borrowed from a collection of stories and essays by E.T.A. Hoffmann. So E.T.A. Hoffmann, very influential writer at the time, was an inspiration for many different composers, not just Schumann. If you're familiar with The Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky, it's a ballet based on a story by E.T.A. Hoffmann. Hoffmann was a favorite author of Schumann's, and kind of inspired Schumann, I guess, to use that title for these works. So each one of these different movements has a descriptive title. The first one that is in your listening examples is Aufschwung, which is simply the German word for soaring. And as the book describes it, it is passionate and impulsive with a very fast tempo, definitely more like the Florestan side of Schumann's personality. So it has this descriptive title, but notice when you look at the listening guide, what form is this? A, B, A, C, A, B, A. It's a rondo, right? Right? It's a 7-part rondo, and the first thing that you hear, that's the A material, and that keeps coming back around in between these contrasting episodes. So another thing, this sort of ties into one of these general bits of information about the Romantic era, which is that Romantic composers were perfectly content to continue using the forms of the classical era. They just would very often give them descriptive titles. The form wasn't really that significant to them so much as the content and what the listener was supposed to feel or imagine. And then the other piece has the title Warum, or Why. And it's marked slowly and tenderly. It's a more introspective, lyrical piece, definitely more sort of the Eusebius side of Schumann's personality, and again in a familiar form, basically an A-B-A form, ternary form, in which the B-A part is repeated. Okay, so next we move on to Clara, who we kind of talked about a little bit already. It's hard to actually talk about the Schumanns separately because they were so intertwined, obviously being married, but whereas Robert is, again, primarily a composer and also music critic, Clara was really, first of all, much more famous than her husband during their lifetime because she was a performer. She was out there in front of the public playing the piano for her career, one of the leading concert pianists of the 19th century. And did do quite a bit of composing in her earlier years, but mostly put that aside once she married Robert and once she saw her role as, first of all, promoting her husband's music, but also promoting what she felt to be the better quality music, not that, let's say, the fluffier, more entertaining, but more trivial works that many of the most popular pianists at the time were performing. There's an awful lot of music composed in the 19th century, and what we see, what we read about in books like these are only what has been determined in retrospect to be the most significant, the most important. But for every one of these important composers that you find in an intro to music textbook, there's probably 10 or 15 whose name you wouldn't recognize, or maybe I might not even recognize, even though that's what I do for a living, because there were a lot of musicians, even then as now, who were maybe popular in their own time, but whose music kind of did not last, did not continue to be popular after their time. And the Schumanns sort of saw, both of them actually, this was kind of like part of Robert's mission with his magazine, and Clara's mission in her performing career was to find and cultivate and bring before the public only the good music and not what they saw as sort of like the trash, the fluff stuff, So for Clara, obviously that meant her husband's music, but also the music of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, etc. And again, this is at a time when a lot of pianists were not interested in playing old music and playing somebody else's music. They wanted to promote their own music. But Clara, I think, was definitely more in the mold of what today's classical pianists, for the most part, do, which is to play the works of other composers from the past, the greatest, most worthy pieces of music, as determined by themselves or, the sort of the general cultural opinion. So again, Clara was trained by her father from a very young age, was a leading child prodigy, and maintained this long career as one of the greatest performers of the 19th century. They talk about her marriage to Robert Schumann, which they say is the day before her 21st birthday. I thought it was the day before her 19th birthday, but it was the day before she would be old enough to marry without her father's consent. And then they mention in here the year 1853 was particularly important for Clara Schumann. The 20-year-old composer Johannes Brahms came to play his works for the Schumanns, beginning a friendship with Clara that would last until her death in 1896. So, although we will not have time to get to Brahms, who is maybe my single most favorite composer of the 19th century, maybe of all time, I can sneak a little bit of discussion of Brahms into my discussion of the Schumanns, because first of all, it was Robert Schumann who kind of discovered, in a sense, Johannes Brahms when young Brahms, he was only 20 years old, and he was really a nobody in the musical world. He had started composing, he had taken piano lessons, and he was trying to make a career as a pianist. But he was not at all a big name, certainly not as a composer, and not really much as a pianist either. He was actually maybe better known as an accompanist for certain famous violinists. So Brahms gets has a mutual friend with the Schumanns, and that is the violinist Joseph Joachim, who is one of the leading violinists of the day. He gets Joachim to write a letter of introduction to Robert Schumann so that he can meet, by this time Schumann is certainly a well-known composer and an influential editor of this music magazine, married to one of the greatest pianists of the time. So Brahms sets out for the Schumann residence. I think they were living in Dresden or someplace by this time. But anyway, Brahms journeys to the Schumann's house and basically just knocks on the door. Total stranger. And the Schumanns invite him in. They see the letter of recommendation or whatever from Joseph Joachim. And Schumann says, "Oh, okay, why don't you have a seat at the piano, maybe play some of your music for us." And Brahms sits down, begins to play something, and Schumann is just blown away and proceeds to write a column for his, which I believe ended up being the last column he ever wrote for his own music magazine, the New Journal for Music. And in this column, he basically says, "Yesterday, a young man came and played his compositions for me, and this guy is the one we've been waiting for. He is like the one whose coming was foretold to us." I mean, this very flowery language, this over-the-top praise of this unknown 20-year-old pianist composer Johannes Brahms. And that definitely got Brahms a lot of attention. And in fact, it was probably more attention than Brahms would have liked, because now he has this huge reputation to live up to, or this hype, I should say, from Schumann to live up to, which he eventually did, becoming, I think, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, I think Brahms is tied for number 4. I think the three greatest are Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart, and I would say tied for 4th place are Schubert and Brahms, but that's my own, this is very personal, obviously. Nonetheless, unfortunately, shortly after that episode, now Brahms became immediately sort of welcomed into the Schumann household, but shortly after that encounter, 1853, the following year was when Robert Schumann sadly attempted suicide and had to be put into an institution. And Brahms actually proved to be very helpful. He basically kind of moved in and looked after all the little Schumann children and helped run the household while Clara was off playing concerts and touring Europe. So Brahms became sort of like almost like a member of the family. And they remained the closest of friends, Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms, for the rest of their lives. If you recall, Schumann, I said, died in 1856, only 46 years old, and complications from his mental illness. Basically, I think the consensus is that Schumann basically just stopped eating, became so mentally ill, he kind of just deteriorated and stopped eating and kind of starved himself to death. Clara survived her husband by 40 years, never remarried. So Clara died in 1896. Brahms died the very next year, 1897. So they were very, very close the rest of their lives. And Brahms's respect for Clara's opinion was such that when Brahms composed something, he would very often send it off to Clara for her to look at it and give feedback before Brahms would publish it. This is kind of unusual for this time. Remember, this is a time when obviously women are not considered equal to men. You know, even places where men can vote, it's very unusual for women to be able to vote. They were considered intellectually inferior. It was considered improper in most cases for a woman to have a performing career such as Clara had. I mean, you think about Mendelssohn's sister, Fanny Mendelssohn, who was probably just as talented as her brother or as Clara, but her family discouraged her from going into music as like a career. And it's not like the Mendelssohns needed to make money to earn a living. I mean, Fanny would have been fine the rest of her life. Her family was very wealthy, so it's not like she really needed the work because she needed the money. Clara needed the work and the money. She had 7 kids to raise, and she had a husband who never really had a steady job for very long. I mean, had some income, but not a lot. I mean, Clara was definitely more the breadwinner in her family. But definitely kind of a trailblazer. Remember, I've said that it's very unusual for a woman to have any kind of a professional career like this as a performer. That is outside of opera. Obviously, you have opera divas who were, professional singers and had big careers. But for an instrumentalist, like a pianist or a violinist, I would say Clara Schumann is really among the first instrumentalists to have a career, to have the kind of career that a man, like, for example, we'll talk about in the next lecture, Niccolo Paganini or Franz Liszt, to have that kind of a performing career, to be the breadwinner for your family as an instrumental performer like Clara Schumann, very unusual. So they have, as an example of Clara's music, a piano trio, not for 3 pianos, for piano, violin, and cello. I believe this is the 3rd movement. And remember what I said again about the traditional forms of the classical era carrying over into the Romantic era. The 3rd movement of a multi-movement piece like of chamber music, like a piano trio, is usually in ternary form, and that's what we have here. A, B, A. It's A prime because it's a slightly different version of A, but it's still ternary form. A, B, A, and then a coda, a concluding section. Okay, so listen to those, and next time we will take up, we'll do another sort of compare and contrast, and this will be our final lecture of the Romantic era, dealing with the 2 most significant figures associated with the piano. Frédéric Chopin, who composed almost exclusively for piano, and Franz Liszt, who was considered the greatest pianist of the 19th century, maybe of all time. Also, obviously, a significant composer for piano, although he composed other types of works as well. So, Chopin and Liszt next time. See you then.